From Beyond Marketing, it's the 20-Minute Call, a podcast about the dreamers, boundary pushers, rebels, and champions of the skydiving industry. Each episode is a narrative journey highlighted by the highs, lows, and luck that the skydiving industry delivers, as told by the most influential people within the sport. If you've ever dreamed of becoming a skydiver, perhaps opening a drop zone, or becoming the next world champion, check out the 20-Minute Call hosted by me, James LeBarry. My guest today is a person who has lived the life of multiple people when considering how many experiences he has packed into his years. He has experienced every emotion attached to living a life within multiple adventure sport communities. His adventures have taken him all over the world. He has seen the best of humanity and its underbelly. His journey includes many adventures that include jumping off of every conceivable object that few in the world have jumped from, whether it be a great sequoia tree, or down a greased ramp of a Skyvan and landing on a slip and slide with all his friends. He's the co-host of the Exit Point podcast, which happens to be one of the most popular podcasts in the parachute flying world, and one of my favorites. He is also the founder of one of the coolest things I've seen in skydiving, a nonprofit called the Freefall Foundation. I'm honored to welcome Matt Blank. Hey, Matt.
Hey, good to be here.
Man, it's great to have you here, and your voice is very familiar to me as I've been digging deeper into your podcast, The Exit Point, which I'm really enjoying. I'm learning so much.
Oh, I'm glad you're enjoying the show.
I am. I'm going to begin our podcast. I don't know how many of our listeners will look at show notes, but I'm going to really advise all our listeners to have a look at the show notes, because there's going to be a ton of various videos and links to all things that you've been associated with through time. So yeah, folks, if you enjoy this podcast, make sure you have a look at the show notes. There's a lot there for sure. So Matt, let's get into it. I want to actually begin where you arrived in my hemisphere, which was this thing called the Freefall Foundation. I think I first came across it like 2016 or so. Can you tell us what is the Freefall Foundation and why did you start it?
Okay, although we're going to have to start with what was the Freefall Foundation because we're no longer doing it.
Mm-hmm, sure.
But the Freefall Foundation was an entity that gifted skydiving instruction to people. And we primarily did tandems, but we also did a fair amount of AFF instruction. And it was something that we ran in Southern California that then ballooned into Northern California and Chicago. We partnered with Drop Zones to give away free skydiving instruction to people that would normally not be able to afford it or wouldn't even know that it existed.
And what inspired that? Why did you decide that you would do that?
It was kind of, well, it was an interesting time for me. I was getting a little burnt out on instruction, and I realized that the benefits of skydiving were not really reaching some of the people that would most need them. You know, like people that were drug offenders, suicidal teens, church deacons, people with disabilities, you know, all these folks that either couldn't afford it or wouldn't have believed that they could pursue skydiving. It was an attempt to kind of rebalance the scales for myself and for the sport itself.
I think anyone that's been around a drop zone for any amount of time, you see what it can mean for people, right? When they see what's possible, I think, you know, that there is more. Did you feel that in terms of the folks that you were bringing in? Did you feel that they were getting a ton out of it, like I think that they would?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like we took this one woman with MS who had lost her ability to walk, and the tandem instructor that was taking her tells her, "Look, you may not be able to walk, but I'm going to teach you how to fly." And after that moment, when she landed, she just her whole life changed. There were a whole new world of possibilities for her to experience, the world. And I can't tell you how life-changing that is for anyone that's part of that experience as well.
Yeah, it's a win-win all the way around. So Matt, I found this to be so unique, right? This is such a different way of thinking, or at least I think it is. It's something that I'd not really seen before, where that it was organized. My takeaway from it with you, or what piqued my interest with you, is there's a sense of empathy, right? Like you're seeing people and their circumstance or whatever that may be, and say, wow, they would really benefit for this. So my question is, tell me about your background. Where does this empathy come from, where you're seeing things beyond yourself?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, at the root of your question, I think that everybody has the capacity for empathy. I think every human being, like aside from the very, very small percentage of people who are sociopathic in nature, have the capacity for empathy. And it's just where we decide to place that empathy that drives our behavior. A lot of people end up in dire straits and need to resort their empathy to empathize with themselves. Some people end up with an inordinate amount of resources and so can empathize with others. I think I was very fortunate in my life to have gotten, where I was, and I ended up with extra capacity to empathize with others. Though I don't think that I'm special in some way, just by being able to empathize.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to dig into here is a lot of people have the ability to have empathy, but very few people necessarily exhibit that. And what struck me was you, particularly when you were doing the Free Fall Foundation, you were a pretty young guy, and I sort of wanted to do some digging. Like, tell me about your childhood a little bit, and is there anything from your childhood that made you more aware of others?
I don't know. I doubt it. I lived a pretty uninteresting childhood. I grew up in Southern California in a track home, middle class family. Went to public school. I was kind of afraid of everything back in the day, and I got into extreme sports in order to not be so afraid of everything. But I don't know that there was anything that happened to me or with me in my childhood that led me to have a greater perspective. I think along the way of getting involved in extreme sports and seeing how short life could be and how beautiful life is, I was given a greater perspective on the value of our time here and our life here. And maybe that was a key to me seeing other people living, less than ideal lifestyles and wanting them to experience life in a more vibrant way.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'm smiling, and I'm not trying to lead you to the psych couch here. It has been so interesting to me, though. You say I didn't really, I had a pretty boring childhood, but I'm from a different country. When I think of what the ultimate childhood looks like in America or in Southern California, I mean, you did it all. BMX by day and surfing when you could, and it sounds like you've been into adventure from a very early age.
Yeah, it was certainly an exciting childhood that had a lot of opportunity to get out into nature. I lived a bike ride away from the beach, and the mountains weren't very far, and it was always easy to find used equipment, here and there, because there were so many people in Southern California doing these activities. And so, yeah, I mean, it was very exciting, very fun. Surfing, BMXing, getting into skateboarding. I can't believe that I survived my childhood without more broken bones, to be honest.
And how many broken bones did you have?
0.
0. That is pretty wild. So what led you to the drop zone for the first time?
I got to the drop zone for the first time because I wanted to learn how to base jump. And this was an intermediary step. I had been rock climbing a whole lot, and I had gotten into big wall rock climbing, which is multi-day ascents up, 1,000-foot faces. And my partner and I were really getting sick of doing the descents. And we stumbled across base jumping at this film festival at a community college near me. And we're like, wow, that would be an incredible tool to use in the mountains. We climb up, we jump down. We don't have to do these ratty descents down the crappy climber trails. That's what we want to do. And so as we explored using that as a tool, we were told, you've got to learn how to skydive. And so that naturally led us to go to the drop zone and learn how to do that.
If you're a DZO or DZM listening to this podcast and you're not using Burble, I've got a question. Why not? If the reason is price, what's the cost of your time? Other booking and manifest softwares are a one-size-fits-all. Burble was built from the ground up by a DZO for DZOs to maximize efficiency. Now, isn't that nice? There's no software that compares. Choose Burble. Burble. So really, jumping or even base jumping was more of a utility for a different sport. But then, of course, you got into what would have been a utility for landing or getting down faster became the beginning of a whole nother life. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's how it started, though both my partner and I left climbing behind after we got into air sports. I mean, it started as a tool for climbing. It became a challenge to progress as a human, into like a new realm. Like we had done the sea, we had done the land. Now it was time to do the air. And, it ultimately became a vehicle to transcend the human experience in a very interesting way, which was not available through any of the other extreme sports that we had done.
Matt, you just said something that you said transcend the human experience. This is where I feel like you're thinking on a different level. And I'm not trying to say that, put you on a pedestal, but, I've not thought in those terms and I'm not sure how old you were at that time. So please state that. But that's thinking on a higher level of transcending the human experience. Could you expound on that?
For sure. And I'll also say that this is a perspective that I've gained over years. It's not something that I realized when I got into it, but it was something that I felt. So let's get into transcending the human experience. Skydiving and base jumping, unlike any other activity, allows you to exist in a zone that is, in many cases, past life, like further than life itself. And in order to really understand that, we'd have to get into quantum mechanics. The thought experiment that somebody should look up if they're interested in is the Schrodinger's cat experiment, wherein which a cat is put into a box, and I'll shortcut the whole thing by saying that 50% of the time this cat will be dead after 5 minutes, 50% of the time it will be alive. And the experimenter asks the subject, without opening the box, is this cat dead or alive? And the subject says, well, I don't know. The experimenter says, right, exactly, we don't know. So what is it right now? It kind of exists in between states, in between life and death, right? And it's not until we open the box that we discover whether it is truly alive or dead. When we're skydiving and base jumping, we put ourselves in a similar position. We put ourselves in between the states of life and death, right? Where if we don't make educated, precise decisions in time, we'll assuredly die. And so to an observer, let's say that we're base jumping, right? And an observer can see us leave the edge, but they can't see us land. And in that space in between us jumping and us landing, somebody asks them, is that person dead or alive? They would have to say well, I don't know. I mean, I think they're alive. They exist kind of in between states at the moment. And in that state of kind of not so much in between life and death, you transcend your human form for a moment, for a brief moment that's incredibly peaceful and very, very, very addicting. A lot of people will meditate for years and years and years just to have one moment that is as transcendent as you get during a skydive or a base jump.
Man, that's I think anyone that's jumped can understand that. And the way that I've heard that described, and I want to ask you if it's the same thing, from your point of view, is truly living in the present.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm not thinking of past, I'm not thinking of future. And it seems like when you meditate, that's what we're all after, is to be present.
Right.
And I can see why that would be addictive.
Yeah, it's a forced present moment.
Let's go a shade deeper there. Is the benefit, that magical space of being completely present has, like, the result of it is it can be incredibly satisfying to have been in that space. But when sharing experiences with others who are in that space and feel that magic with you, but then let's say tragically I hate to sound so like sharp, but they die. So the consequence of this addictive feeling, but then of course there's so many of the cons that come with it. How do you wrestle with that, particularly in the, let's say, base jumping, where the risks are high and we have lost a lot of our friends?
Right. Well, I mean, we can take this to a lot of other addictive behavior and say, the overarching goal is once you get the message, hang up the phone. A lot can be learned off of just one experience doing this. It's not that you need to return to that one activity in order to continue to experience this transcendence. It's that you recognize that transcendence is possible, that time and space are, somewhat flexible and relative. And to take the lessons that you've learned doing that activity to normal life and try and apply it, not just continue to return to the same activity that's given you that experience over and over again. Clearly, if you're going to put yourself into the danger zone, the death zone over and over again, then your probabilities for getting injured or dying increase dramatically.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking to myself, man, Matt has been in so much thought from these experiences, all the great times, the low times, which I think is also a wonderful gift of continuing to return to that place, because there's a lot of processing, the good, the awesomeness of being present and what that means. And, the harshness of life of when we lose people. Like, I imagine you've spent a lot of time thinking through your journey. Am I right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lifetime that can be gained just from one single jump and, reflecting on it. When you talk about processing, this is one of those realms where that word makes total sense to me. Somebody that jumps will process a very small amount of it because it's so intense. And when you land, oftentimes people will be like, wow, what happened? They'll forget all these details, and it'll take them sitting down and reliving the experience to really fill in those gaps and to process what just happened, because your mind has been going so fast through all of these, different realms that it's hard to be aware of everything all at once. And so, there's a lifetime that can be gained from just, thinking about reliving, reimagining all of the jumps that have been done.
Yeah, I'm quite fascinated by, I said in the intro that I feel like you've lived a life of many people because you've soaked up so much in your adventures. And I'm not even sure that you can be classified. I don't know. Are you more of a skydiver or a base jumper? Or, I don't know that it even matters, but man, you've done so much and you have a very unique perspective. It's incredible.
Oh, thanks. As far as how, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, as far as how to categorize myself, I would say that I wouldn't categorize myself as either of those things, and intentionally so. I think that people get into trouble a lot when they start categorizing themselves as those people, because then it starts driving their behavior, and I've always been somebody that's really enjoyed skydiving, and I've always been somebody that's really enjoyed base jumping. But it wouldn't be even close to the top of my list when somebody says, "Who are you?"
That's really interesting. So much of our identities are tied to the thing that we're doing. It's interesting that you have that perspective. really almost from the onset, it seems like.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a lot of people get into a lot of trouble identifying, with those categories and building their personality around them. Your personality has nothing to do with the objectives that people can observe. Your personality is the underlying core values that drive you. And to say like up top, like I'm a skydiver is strange. Also, like, what is that really? Like, unless there is an underlying core value or structure that drives every skydiver, which I don't think exists. I think we're all very, very different. Then it would be hard to, stand on that statement and say, I am a skydiver.
Yeah, it makes me smile though, because that's very prevalent, isn't it? There's that joke of, how do you know if somebody is a skydiver? Just wait a couple of minutes and they'll tell you. It does seem to be so wrapped in our identities. Well, let's come back to base in terms of our storyline with you. You learned to skydive at Skydive Paris. You got all your ratings. I mean, you were a tandem instructor, an AFF instructor. What other ratings did you have, or do I have them all?
I know I was also a static line instructor, IAD. I was a wind tunnel instructor, a wingsuit coach. I did every instructional rating that I possibly could. And I got into every realm that was tangential to skydiving that I could along the way.
And then how deep into your skydiving career did you actually start getting into base?
Well, pretty rapidly. And we might be able to come back to the word career, but let's just say that like I'll accept that term if everyone accepts that we're using it in the loosest possible sense that career can be defined. Okay. But yeah, I started base jumping very, very earlier than I should have, down to the minimums.
And tell me about that experience. As I've got a lot of listeners, this is mostly a lot of skydivers and a lot of folks wishing to get into base. Share your first base jumping experience. What was that like?
It was absolutely terrifying. It was January. We were at the bridge in Twin Falls, Idaho. My climbing partner and I had convinced Jimmy and Marta to do a winter course, even though they told us like, the weather's going to be terrible. So we're out there, it's snowing, it's freezing. We are also dealing with a lot of information that has, just been imparted to us. And we're at the extent of our skill sets, having, just done the bare minimum skydiving. And I'm standing on this rail and I'm like basically catatonic, like my body is telling me, don't do this, like with every ounce of strength. And like every time I start to go, my body's like, no, it just won't move. And it was a really challenging breakthrough moment to get myself to jump off of the bridge for the first time.
Is that the most scared you've ever been?
Physically, yes. Physically, yes, absolutely. Emotionally, no, I could get to drive into some other areas where I was more emotionally afraid, but I've never experienced that kind of freeze before or after.
So are you a logger? How many base jumps do you have now?
I am a terrible logger. So I stopped logging skydives after I got all of my ratings because it seemed almost irrelevant. I should have logged my base jumps because it would be a nice thing to be able to look back on and kind of, relive some of the experiences. When we're talking about, reflecting on experiences, here's something that I will bemoan. Like I've done thousands of base jumps and I can only remember about hundreds of them. And so that means that I've risked my life unnecessarily, or somewhat unnecessarily thousands of times because I can't even recall the experience. Um, so like my last solid number, which I got because my partner logged quite diligently, was in 2015. And in 2015, we were about at 1,500 base jumps. Since then, I've circumnavigated the globe multiple times and jumped at, dozens of events, and I have no idea what I'm at now. I would estimate somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000.
Wow. That's an incredible number considering how scared you were on your very first jump.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. But I mean, that was the challenge, right? That's what really sucked me in, was because it was that terrifying. I came to the bridge assuming that I would just crush it. I mean, I was free solo rock climbing and big wave surfing and BMX riding, and this was just another thing. It really taught me that, you don't find out who you are on those edges of life. You find out who you could be. And right there, I found out that I could be much more than I had given myself credit for. And so that's what really hooked me into it, was knowing that there was so much more to progress with in this particular realm, and, as a human being.
So you have progressed.
Absolutely.
There was so much more you could progress towards. Do you feel a sense of satisfaction at the progress, or is there a typical, human perspective of, I'm underachieving, or I could be doing more with my life? I know that's a big leap, deep question there, but we have the benefit of armchair quarterback from you felt that you could get, now we're thousands of jumps past that. How do you feel?
Both of those things. I feel that I can definitely achieve more with my life, and I'm striving to do that. And I also feel incredibly satisfied with where I've come. One of the biggest fears in my life was the fear of death and dying. Overcoming that fear and aligning that fear has given rise to a freedom of behavior that was unimaginable to me before I got into base jumping. And that's incredibly satisfying.
That's a huge statement. I recall you saying that anyone who is, forgive me, I don't know I can't remember the literal quote, but it was more or less saying anyone who doesn't fear death, words to the effect of doesn't have something to live for.
Yeah.
Scurrying around my notes here. But that's not you.
To unwind that statement, first, that one comes from the movie Camelot, and the statement is, he who fears nothing loves nothing, because they're not afraid to leave it behind. I don't necessarily agree with that still, but I will say that it is an interesting thing to look at when somebody says, I'm not afraid of anything, because there are so many ways to get to that point. One way to get to the point of fearing nothing is to value life incredibly, to the point where like the now moment is all that exists. And in that space, fear doesn't really exist. There's also the opportunity to devalue life to the point where it is like just nothing. No one cares. You don't care about it. And in that space, there is no room for fear as well. So I think there are many roads to like not fearing death. I don't necessarily think that somebody who fears nothing also loves nothing. I think that those concepts can coexist together.
To our audience who's listened to this podcast, I recognize that we're going deeper beyond just normal experiences, but I'm fascinated by this because in order to value life, you have to experience loss, I think. Where you could become indifferent to life is if you're desensitized by it being just joyful all the time. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that loss definitely gives a lot of perspective when we're, trying to assign value to life. And I find quite often jumpers not valuing their life appropriately because they haven't, experienced any kind of loss. And so that eventuality is literally lost on them. Anyone that's lost a friend and then lived beyond that point, like, understands what that person gave up. If you empathize with their position and go like, wow, yeah, they lived a rad life until they were, 20 something. And now I've lived, 15, 20 years after that. This is what they've given up. Oh my God. Like, wow.
It's an interesting dichotomy, because what we all try to do is avoid pain, or many people try to avoid pain or loss because it hurts. But the outcome of that is appreciation, right? Where you take stock. But at the same time, sometimes loss can be overwhelming to one, where it's difficult to recover from the loss. And in base jumping, there is so much loss, particularly for a period of time there where all of us have friends that we've lost to the sports. How do you manage it? Particularly those that you've shared experiences with, that you're close to, and it not overtake you to where you can't come back and appreciate all that you appreciate in your life? I know that's a deep question.
Yeah, but there are some pretty easy steps to take. Well, simple steps, not easy, but simple. The first of which is to prepare for loss. If you never conceptualize loss, if you never consider it, if you never imagine it, then when it eventually hits you, it's going to be detrimental. It's going to be, it's just the train, you're going to be on the tracks and just get obliterated by it. But preparing for it is lessens the load. Like, for instance, like my climbing partner and I, Ian Flanders, who I did lose eventually in base jumping, we talked about losing each other all the time, what it would be like and what we would want for one another and how we should handle it and all of this. And in so doing, when I eventually did lose him, I was not questioning how to manage that particular situation. I already had my partner by my side, basically shepherding me through that entire scenario. I don't think it's about, so much reconciling the loss, but feeling, finding out how to carry it. Losses can be heavy when you have a lot of regret, like you haven't lived a full life with that person, you have left things unsaid or undone. And that speaks to the preparedness as well. The friends that I've lost where I've left nothing unsaid, nothing undone. We knew exactly how we felt about each other. Those losses I don't carry as heavily as the ones where I have a bunch of missed opportunities and regret. So I think that's stage one of it is preparedness.
I want to hone in on that. There is an incredible video that was put out by GoPro that featured the story of you and Ian. I believe it was called We Were Knights.
When We Were Knights, yeah.
When We Were Knights. And rather than me retell it, would you just give the narrative or the overview of that video? And I encourage everyone to check it out in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah. After his death, one of our good friends, Anson Fogel, who is an incredible director and filmmaker, wanted to do something to, honor Ian. And, we started kicking ideas back and forth. And eventually we just hit a brick wall of we can't really encapsulate who this person was. And then he attended a memorial service that I had put on in Southern California. And during that service, I read this letter that I had written to Ian in the event that I died before him. I had written letters to so many people, hundreds of letters. In the event that I had died, like base jumping, then all these letters would get sent out. The people that I'd left behind would at least have something to remember me by and, have a couple of words to help them through the processing of my loss. So I read the letter out loud that I had written to Ian in the event of my death. And Anson was like, that's it. That's the film. Let's get a bunch of archival footage, let's have you read that letter during the filming process, and let's let that be the story.
It is a beautiful story. Heartache in the intro as we learn about how Ian passed, and then even to the honoring of his life in terms of carrying his ashes around in a coffee can on adventures all over the U.S. Including a clip of a gas station attendant sort of asking you about the can, very curiously.
Yeah.
It's beautiful because it tapped on a lot of different emotions of me feeling sad, but also feeling like it was a real celebration of his life.
Yeah. I mean, the two things go hand in hand, right? Like you said, loss gives perspective to life. If without the sad, there can be no happy. Like all of this stuff is in balance. Yes, it's tragic, but it also gives rise to a lot of vibrance and a lot of love that was shared in and surrounding his life.
So you wrote thousands of letters.
Hundreds, I would say. Yes.
Hundreds, excuse me. So are they sort of stamped and ready to go upon your passing?
No, actually, I completely changed my strategy after Ian died because he never got to actually hear that letter from me. And that was one regret that I have to take to my grave. And I kind of resigned myself to not having that regret in the future. And so rather than having those letters just sealed and ready to be delivered when I died, I just called all those people up and saw them in person and told them exactly what those letters said, because the time is now. There's no reason to leave those things on the table. And I think that's another thing that loss really can give you. It drives you to, motivates you to do things that you ordinarily would not have, and not make the same mistakes twice. And so there are positives that come out of these epic losses, because they improve your life and the lives of the people around you if you really take the energy of that loss and apply it to something that you want to see happen.
Yeah, Matt, something I wrote down, I feel like there's so much perspective that you've had in both great adventures and hard losses. I mean, that's the ultimate gift is a perspective of appreciation, of gratitude. And I want to be careful not to venture into things that I don't know about. For example, when I read of friends, going through experiences, say with ayahuasca, and I wonder, is that sort of a different path to the same desired outcome of perspective? Certainly both crossover of really getting out of what we're comfortable, which when we're comfortable, we don't think, we don't often process. It's almost you're on cruise control, and those experiences that I'm reading about that I want to be very clear I know nothing about, though, I feel like it awakes the mind to think differently. And I will be honest, and I'm getting to my point here, I felt challenged because I know that your perspective is so uniquely different than my own. And I really want to make sure that I can learn from you to think about, wow, I don't necessarily want a base jump to have the perspective that you have. And I certainly don't necessarily want pain. Can I have perspective without all of that? I don't know that I can.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, I mean, all you have to do is look at here. This is going to be an interesting one. Look at the swastika. The swastika was originally a symbol, a Chinese symbol, the meaning of which is that all roads lead to center. That's applicable here when we're talking about perspective. All of the things that you've just mentioned, psychedelics, extreme sports, all of them are tools in order to gain perspective. And all roads lead to center. Some of them are longer than others. Some of them are shorter. Some of them are short-lived. Some of them give you perspective over a long period. But there's nothing that I understand that could not be understood simply by staring at grass grow for the rest of your life.
That's an interesting perspective. Yeah, that is interesting.
And I absolutely do not recommend base jumping for everybody. It's not the tool for everybody. It's the tool for some people. And skydiving is the tool for some people. And inherently, you know that when you like engage with it, and the emotional experience is something that is in alignment with who you are. But you can gain all of the same perspective through so many different avenues.
If you're a fan of the 20-Minute Call, I'd like to invite you to be a member of a budding community with me on Patreon. By becoming a patron of the show, you can join me behind the scenes to discuss options for future guests and gain access to some show swag. It's pretty sweet. Details on how to become a patron can be found in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. From your perspective with base jumping, you've been doing it so long. You've gained a lot of wisdom, and I initially had a question of, has it given you more than it's taken? And then I started thinking while you were speaking here is, I don't know if it's either. It is what it is. It's perspective. Are you tired of loss? Because you've lost a lot.
Am I tired of loss? Well, I am weary of tragic loss. Yeah. I think that like we have grown to expect more loss than is acceptable, especially in base jumping. 25 to 35 deaths a year in a community of 4,000 people, in my viewpoint, is incredibly exorbitant and unnecessary. If you look at communities that deal with a lot of loss, and we're not just talking extreme sports, like if you go into like inner cities where somebody's getting shot on a daily basis, you'll see that like their emotional capacity is drained, and that like the effects of a single loss, even if it's not somebody that's, personally connected to you, those effects balloon out and affect many, many people. I am definitely weary of some of the tragic loss in our community, especially when it is unintentional. I am less weary of just loss that looks authentic. In many cases, people come to base jumping and sky sports with the mentality that they are going to burn the candle at both ends, stick wicks in the middle, burn those motherfuckers too, and try and live more life in 30 years than most people do in 100. And my hat's off to them. It's not the life that I'm like personally driving for, but I am not weary of seeing people like that who authentically drive into their path and end up losing their lives. I am, however, very tired of people who don't understand what they're giving up and learn hard lessons because they don't know what they don't know.
How do you teach that? I mean, you own a base jumping school.
Yeah.
How do you teach that without, you are the Jedi Master, if you will. You are Yoda now, right? And I don't mean to make light of it, but you've learned in the school of hard knocks of base, if you will, that, when most people come into the sport, there's this youthful naivete, this enthusiasm. They haven't experienced all that you have, and thank God that maybe they haven't. How do you guide without, snuffing that drive, but also working in thoughtfully of how the approach should be in learning to base? Because, the cliche that we see is, yeah, let's do this. And it's all of that. If you're a seasoned veteran in base and maybe you don't feel that level of enthusiasm once you first did, how do you walk that line of not curtailing enthusiasm, but, hey, don't let your enthusiasm become your cause for injury or death?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the hallmark lessons that I hope our culture learns is that this is not the place to lend or borrow confidence. As somebody that's an educator, I don't lend confidence to anyone's pursuits. I lend skill set, I lend knowledge, I lend expertise, I lend guidance. Those things can help them find their own authentic path. when we're talking about self-awareness, which I guess is that the root of what you're asking, that all has to do with asking the right questions at the right time. I'm not going to rain on someone's parade when they come in enthusiastically. There are there are reasonable people who are enthusiastic about base jumping. I was enthusiastic about base jumping. One cannot be said to be unhealthy when they are enthusiastic about jumping into a realm where few humans have ever existed. That's incredible. However, I will do my best to question everything that they know about the sport, about the pursuit, about themselves, in order to really get to the center of whether that enthusiasm is long-term, coming from a sustainable place or an unsustainable place. And after we've answered those questions, it's up to me to then ask follow-ups and, give examples of people that have had those similar explanations and allow that person to then adjust their own trajectory if they see fit. It's about giving them a compass by which they can sort through this environment, rather than trying to give them some prescription that's going to keep them on, quote unquote, the path.
That's very wise. I feel like it's a fine line to educate and ask the right questions at the right time. It's a lot of responsibility. Do you ever have to have the conversation when the messaging through questioning isn't getting through, that, hey, maybe this isn't for you? You're about the clicks on YouTube and your social channels, then embracing the beauty and that's what I've come to learn in listening to your podcast, is this is a beautiful sport, and it creates one, or forces one, to have to wrestle with things so far beyond social media clicks. And I imagine that there's a lot in the sport today and those coming in that want that. Are you the person that says, hey, I know that that's what you want, but or this is not for you? Or do you just give the information and let them figure it out for themselves from there? You've done your part.
Well, yes, ultimately my part is to make sure that the person that's, getting into these environments is aware of the dangers and risks. Now, when we're talking about motivation, I don't think that the labels of good or bad are appropriate. Healthy and unhealthy might be appropriate, but we have to start with honest and dishonest. And that's really what will determine whether a motivation is healthy or unhealthy. So, the social media clicks, that one gets a lot of haterade, right? A lot of people would say hey, that's just not the way to get into this, not the reason to get into this. I'll give you one counterpoint, however. The father of base jumping, Carl Banish, really was about sharing base jumping in the form of film media. He would wait on the top of a building until sunrise so that he could get the best shot, because he understood that a lot of people wouldn't be able to experience this directly and would need to do it through another medium. And so he definitely was about trying to get as many eyes on his artistic expression as possible. He was definitely honest about that, and he aligned his practice to suit that. Now, it's worth saying that by the end of his life, he had slightly changed his motivation, which led to his own death in base jumping. And so we could rabbit hole on that all day long. But back to the point. Somebody that's out there for social media clicks, if they're honest about that, which few people actually are, but if they're honest about that, there is a way to execute in the realm of base jumping that is somewhat sustainable, if they understand that they are out there just for that. My next question to them, though, is to drive it what they are giving up in order to achieve their goal, and then to ask whether it's worth it. Like, what does success look like in this world to you? 1,000,000 likes, 1,000,000 followers, 1,000,000 whatever, blah, 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 on and on. Okay. What is the probability that you'll succeed here? Are you willing to die in order to achieve that goal? If somebody says yes to those, now I'm even more curious because I'm not. I'm not willing to die for likes. And if somebody is, I really want to know what's in their head. I want to know how they've arrived at that conclusion because it seems so extreme to me. And before we get into like word one of like the skill set required to be engaging in that environment, I'm going to cover all the bases until I think that what they're doing is healthy and sustainable. And if not, then I've taken them as far as I possibly can, right? That's where my duty ends. Like, that's where I say to them, hey, like, I've given you the limit of my experience. You seem to be on a trajectory that I don't have any expertise in. I cannot follow you down that path. I cannot lead you down that path because I've never been there. And so you're going to have to find somebody else.
It's an interesting dichotomy when we talk about likes, right? You have been a professional skydiver and base jumper, and that's a really hard thing to monetize. You know, I wanted to ask it earlier, but it wasn't appropriate at the time. But I assume, and please tell us how does one be able to make enough money to travel the world multiple times as a professional base jumper? I mean, most of it is video driven, clicks driven. How have you not got lost in that, going, I need those clicks to live this lifestyle and have alignment with your goals? What we just talked about were those coming in with the goals of maybe clicks and the costs. But how do you get into this to your level without getting lost in it?
That's an incredibly complicated question, and I'll say that I'm not doing that anymore. So it's a tough one to balance. Anyone that's looking into being a professional in something that they are passionate about should also look into the concept of over-justification. It's called the over-justification principle, and it's been studied for 100 years. There's empirical data about this principle, which is basically that if you're engaging in something that you intrinsically want to do, as soon as another reason is given to you to do that thing, you start losing some of the intrinsic motivation to do it. For instance, kids playing with toys are then rewarded with money in order to continue playing with the toys. While they were playing with the toys intrinsically and happily to begin with, they now are not playing with them with such very much motivation until they are paid, and then they engage because they are being paid. And so fighting that off is really difficult. I can say that I haven't taken on a single sponsor or project that has made me do anything. Any sponsor that I've taken on, I've had in the contract that I'm going to continue expressing myself in the way that I have grown accustomed to. And if their product fits into that space, then great. Then we can have a mutually beneficial relationship in which I promote your equipment as well as you promote my expression.
I have a feeling, though, that perspective is so mature. Would I be incorrect in saying that you're one of the few that think that way? I mean, what we're talking about is great self-awareness and objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, I studied psychology as my major. And so I came into this world knowing that was going to be a pitfall, the over-justification of it. Also, a lot of people get trapped into looking at people's lifestyles that have made a professional career out of something that they enjoy without considering what those people are sacrificing. It's all good on the internet. But when you break it down and you go like, all right, who's the most successful base jumper of all time, and what does their lifestyle look like? And do I actually want that lifestyle for myself? If the top 1%, if succeeding globally, if, being the top of the market means that, I'm retiring in a suburb of Southern California with, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath and still grinding into my 50s, sacrificing my body. Ooh, like I might change my direction here. Like that might not be a goal that I really want to go after. But I think a lot of people get trapped into believing that the lifestyles that these people are living are much more exciting and much more supported and stable than they actually are.
Just like anything, with social, we only see the best of everything. We never see the down days.
Right. You don't see the down days. You don't see the sacrifice that people have made. You don't see the single track that these people have railroaded themselves into, such that they have like really reduced their amount of freedom later in life. If you're going to be a career skydiver, my suggestion is that you have a backup plan, hedge your bets, have a degree to fall back on, have another career to fall back on, because if you end up in your mid to late 30s, having only been a professional skydiver, you are going to have little to no marketable skills in the rest of the world. And you're going to find yourself in kind of dire straits, having to prove to the world that you can do something outside of this extreme sport that no one really gives a crap about. To the rest of the world, you are not an expert. You are a crazy person. You're not somebody that is great at like risk mitigation. You are somebody who is risk tolerant to the point where you're a liability.
I don't think many skydivers or base jumpers can say that with as much clarity as you just have. And the word that's resonating with me is self-awareness. And so I want to move in a different direction on the topic of self-awareness. I am not a base jumper, and I am fascinated by your podcast, Exit Point. One thing that I'm so intrigued by is having enough self-awareness when it's go time. And what I mean by that is, particularly I would imagine if you're an early jumper in base, that your emotions are running extremely high. And there is fear and managing the fear. And then there's your gut. And recognizing or having the self-awareness to know the difference when the gut says, ooh, I'm not feeling this today. But because of fight or flight, you're not feeling it anyway until you step off. Oftentimes, when you reflect on something that you got away with, I should have listened to my gut. But that's the benefit of hindsight. But when you're there, how as a base jumper are you able, amidst the feelings of emotions, of go, not go, of what is the difference between your gut and self-doubt?
Right. So gut feeling is a skill set that, in my opinion, you should develop before getting into base jumping. It's something that like I try and impart to people who are raising kids too, and say like, you can protect your kids, but also let them make mistakes, let them get injured, and they will build intuition and awareness for dangerous situations. And as I got into like BMX riding and big wave surfing and skateboarding and all these other realms, which were less consequential than base jumping, I was able to build that gut feeling through trial and error, through mistake, saying like, okay, I'm not feeling this, but I'm going to push it anyway. Boom. End up taking a huge digger and wiping out. Great. Next time you feel that thing, understand that it is reasonable. Once I got to base jumping, I had, 2 decades worth of experience listening to my gut and observing those very subtle emotional cues that could tell me whether like I was pushing past my own personal limits. So like self-awareness happens over time, and it happens through trial and error, and it happens through observation and analysis before the jump, taking a breath before whatever activity, taking a breath and just trying to write your own news report of what's happening, like stepping 6 inches outside of your body and trying to just narrate the scene. And then afterwards, being completely honest with how it turned out and why. And then connecting the dots between what you were feeling beforehand and what, occurred during, and then what happened afterward.
I feel like what you're saying is almost superhuman, right? Like, I know that's a muscle that needs to be flexed. And in listening to your podcast, what really got my thoughts going was in episode, I believe it was 2, when Sarah Taz was on your podcast. I think it was her. And she literally went in and miraculously survived. But listening to her recount that experience of, hey, I'm going to be following somebody that's very experienced, and, I'm with a group of people that are very experienced. Almost you're hearing the justification as she fights the gut of, this isn't feeling quite right. And the plan changing multiple times. And even with that plan changing so many times, still exited, still made the jump. And I go, wow, if someone with that much experience, then anyone could make the mistake. Of course, we're all human. I think my takeaway is, man, you really, to base jump is way more technical than I ever thought it was. If it was Carl Banish exiting, it just looks, I'm just jumping. And there's not a lot to it. Obviously, we're only seeing the finished product, but base jumping is way more technical than I ever thought that it was, both emotionally and from a technical standpoint. Gosh, I feel like you're always having to check yourself. Am I okay? Am I in the right frame of mind? Am I tired? Gosh, it's a lot.
I mean, to begin with, yes. And I'll also, say that I've gotten lucky. Like I've gotten lucky just like Taz. I've almost died multiple times because like I misread a cue, or I misread the situation, or I fell victim to external forces, and pressured myself into doing something. Like that statement I made earlier of don't lend or borrow confidence is a statement that I learned after nearly going in. not as like dramatically as Taz, but like nearly going in. And so, yeah, like the mechanics of base jumping are simple. The execution of base jumping is wildly complicated. And it does take a lot of practice to get to a point where you can do it successfully, which is why, like, you start with mentors, you start with people who are those voices in your head that can be reliable narrators, that can question what you're doing until you have an internal dialogue that is confident and correct.
Hopefully correct, I suppose.
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, you can...
Yeah. I mean, Matt, I follow your base jump school on Instagram. When you're teaching, it's definitely not a for clicks channel. It is very informative, and I'm amazed by all that one needs to take into account. Or when I listen to various different folks on your podcast and hearing the calculus of the numbers versus the wingsuit that they're jumping, it's almost scientific. Man, it's not what it once was. Whereas, let's go and jump off that thing for shits and giggles.
Well, I think there are both sides of that still. I would say that they were probably more scientific about it back in the day because they had to be. There were a lot more unknowns versus today, the upper levels of the sport are, yes, very scientific, but there's a lot of opportunity for people to just get into it and be facilitated and not learn a damn thing, really, and still go huck their meat off of a fixed object. And there are plenty of people that misunderstand the complexities of base jumping who are willing to, and I put this in quotations, deal you those drugs and not take responsibility for the consequences.
I would imagine because of your approach is so thoughtful that for those that are on quote unquote, not necessarily the literal drugs, but you're a bit of the, the serious guy. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but I would imagine there is a perspective of that because you're more measured, you're more thoughtful from your experiences in how you approach this sport. Am I right?
I mean, that's me now, right? That's me now as an educator, turning 40, wanting everybody that's coming up behind me to make intentional and informed decisions about how they want to use their body and their life. And so my persona has become very serious and respectful. Whereas that certainly wasn't where I started, man. I was wild. I was hucking double gainers on my sixth jump. I was terrain flying well before I should be. I was doing all this crazy stuff because it was fun and exciting. Now looking back, I can say that all those things were definitely possible. I should have approached them differently. And I'm hoping that people do it better than I did. I'm hoping that, my input into our culture will allow people to get everything that I've gotten out of it without learning any lessons the hard way.
It's interesting, the arc of seeing you on video. The earlier days, you got a very full head of hair, and there's a particular couple of base jumps off of a high tower, I want to say somewhere in the Middle East, and you exit with it's so much freedom. It's joyful to watch. Then as we go through the arc, it definitely it feels a little different. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think that's just, as we go through different stages and have different perspectives throughout, it's interesting to see, though, because it is documented.
Well, I'd say that both of those expressions were me at my best. Back when I was doing, all that radical aerial stuff off of towers, I was extremely practiced and very current and very aware of the boundaries of base jumping. And that's what allowed me to do that with such abandon. And that's what allows people to do skydiving with such abandon. If you understand what is really required to survive the jump, and you understand to a precise degree when you need to do certain activities like pull, be stable, and where you can gain that control to facilitate those actions, then in the middle of those boundaries, you can do whatever the fuck you want. It wouldn't matter if I, hucked myself off of KL Tower doing anything. I could literally just chuck myself off of that thing because I knew where I needed to be stable. I had been an expert wind tunnel flyer. So in low airspeed, I would be able to reorient no matter what was happening to get a solid pitch window. And I was canopy pilot enough that, if I pulled, after 5 seconds before 7 seconds, then I was going to make that main landing area. Absolutely. That's what gave me that abandon then. My progression to now has slowed down substantially because I'm just not willing to put that time in anymore. And I know that. I know that I'm not in the foam pit every day. I'm not going out and working on my air awareness and my proprioception and my canopy skills. I'm not on the drop zone doing 2,000 jumps a year and 200 base jumps a year. So what is the limit of my jumping at this point? Creative handhelds. Funny looking handhelds.
This podcast is sponsored by Beyond Marketing, the digital marketing agency for the skydiving industry. Now, I'm not a fan of lots of ads during a podcast. I mean, who likes ads? So I'll stop talking about how marvelously wonderful Beyond Marketing is. But if you're curious about what the amazing people of Beyond Marketing do to help drop zones and manufacturers thrive, then you should check out their website at dropzone.marketing. That's dropzone.marketing. You said earlier that, hey, if you don't have a plan and you're, jumping as a professional skydiver through your 30s, then, you're going to need to have a backup plan. You just mentioned that you're 40 or about to be. You're running a base jump school. What is your plan? Are you looking to grow your base jump school, or do you have other plans in the works, or are you already executing on that?
I don't know what the future will bring for this school. I hope that it becomes bigger than me. I'm trying to partner with other people that are experts in their field, like Will Kiddo and Taylor Cole to teach canopy piloting, Johnny Corthius to teach, aerials and rope rescue, Sean Devlin to teach water rescue, Brian Germain to teach canopy fundamentals, Laurent to teach, wingsuits, like all of these different people, because I think it takes a village. It's not just one person that can give you your whole education. And I hope by the time that I find that I'm no longer useful, that somebody's willing to pick up the torch. The ultimate goal behind Basecamp, behind this program, was to raise the minimum standard of education in base jumping, which I think is far too low. I think the minimum standard for education in sky sports in general, like in skydiving, is far too low. And when people say we could be doing better, I look at them like they're just saying nothing at all. Like, that's just such an obvious statement that I don't even think it's worth saying. We should be doing better is a statement that I think that everyone should be making in air sports currently.
Let's lean into that a little bit heavier. Matt, you have a very unique perspective because, unless anyone hasn't picked up on this yet, you're a teacher. I mean, you have been I felt silly with the volume of ratings that you had that I didn't realize in skydiving. You had, a ton. But you've also been an instructor in other sports outside of base and skydiving that we haven't even talked about. Can you just recount us where you've been, and then let's get into teaching philosophy?
Sure. Yeah. So I graduated from UCI with a degree in psychology, focusing on sports psychology. And since then, I wanted to apply my degree to a realm that had a little more room to actually affect people's lives. Rather than getting into clinical psychology, I got into extreme sports because I thought teaching in those realms gave people a better platform to understand themselves. And it's easier to be honest with who you are and where you want to go if you're doing something active versus just sitting in a chair. I got into rock climbing instruction. So I was a chief rock climbing instructor at one of the biggest programs in Southern California. I was a mountain guide for many years. I taught freestyle and all mountain snowboarding at Vail Resorts as a double ASI instructor. I taught wind tunnel. I taught military jumping. I taught wingsuiting and base jumping in almost every discipline in skydiving. For my entire life, I have been an extreme sports instructor in some way. I've also not only instructed, but I think this is a more important part that really eludes a lot of instructors. You got to keep learning. You've got to keep being a student so that you can empathize with students. If you continue to just be an expert in your own field and you never return to being a student, then you will not understand why people are having such trouble understanding the concepts that you're trying to impart, right? And so along the way, I've also learned a bunch. I've gotten into paragliding and speed flying and scuba diving and free diving and highlining and all these other things that I quite honestly sucked at until I started to learn them. And along the way, continued to build my empathy for people that couldn't understand how I was explaining something.
Yeah, there's that word again, empathy.
It's the key to all instruction. It is the key to all instruction. If you cannot meet a student where they are and literally meet them there, like, see the world through their eyes, then you will fail as an instructor to bring them along to where they should be.
Let's move into another subject here as we wind down. I'm
Okay.
curious, you have a very specific perspective. Who are your mentors? Who do you look up to in terms of how they teach or what they've accomplished? Who do you admire both in skydiving and base?
Oh, I mean, the list is endless there, you know?
Yeah, I feel like I should do away with that question. That is always a tough one.
Yeah. I've got a list of a ton of people that I could rattle off if you want. What are you looking for?
Let's reframe it. Let's has there been a couple folks that have been instrumental, that have really impacted you to think a certain way or that have challenged you to be better? Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, my first jump course instructor, my AFF instructor, Karen Lewis, who from the very beginning put me and my partner on a great track to be successful in base jumping, because she was a base jumper herself and an excellent skydiver, excellent in every realm, from competition four-way to wingsuit base jumping. Just an absolute incredible person. While she was teaching me how to skydive, I was soaking up philosophy from Dan BC, who is arguably one of the best skydivers of all time. I don't know anyone that is as good at anything as he is at four-way or belly flying or, belly skydiving. I think that like somebody that attains that level of expertise in any realm has philosophies that will transcend the activity itself. And so I learned an incredible amount from Dan on, how to be a person within the sport. Onto like Marty Jones, who was the rigger at Paris, who taught me an incredible amount about rigging. I mean, his family invented the tail pocket. Like he was, packing reserves when he was 8 years old. Like the man is just like an encyclopedia of unknown knowledge when it comes to parachutes. Onto like Craig O'Brien, who was, the resident photographer on the drop zone. At the time that I was learning all of this stuff, I was right across the street from Apex. Apex was right down the street from Paris. And so like I was in Todd Schubotten's office, like day one of AFF, learning about base jumping technology and like what I needed to do to be successful in base jumping, that, hooked me up with Jimmy and Marta, like who were mentors for me through my entire life as a base jumper. Looking back to before I was even a base jumper, when I was a rock climber and I was climbing with Matt Gerdes' brother, Nathan, and thinking about getting into base jumping. And he's like, hey man, like, you should talk to my brother about this. And this is before like Matt became like such a, large figure in the sport. Like he was just an expert level jumper and not like the owner of Squirrel. And so like before I even got going, I was in his ear and he was imparting wisdom and knowledge about how to be an excellent base jumper, like onto like the people that I've met along the way, like, Will Kiddo and Taylor Cole and Annie Helliwell and, Bertrand Cloutier and Rich Webb, like the man that put on the map what it was like to be an excellent pilot, and all of his expertise from flying, naval jet fighters into what we were actually doing as wingsuit pilots. And I mean, the list just goes on. I feel like I'm so lucky to have brushed across all of these people along the way and in such interesting realms. Although, like, I think the person that helped me the most of all of these people that I, could name is my partner, Ian Flanders. And he is that person because we spent so much time progressing and being honest with ourselves and each other about the mistakes that we were making and where we were deficient and needed to improve. And there's no substitute for that. somebody that like is really living a life alongside yours can see much more about who you are and your patterns and your behaviors and your competencies than anyone could that's an expert that's, on the outside looking in.
Matt, do you think that can be recreated? And I mean, the bond is so special when you are in the in-between, in those moments. And as I assume you are, jumping less, and those experiences of traveling around the world are less and less, is there another phase, another set of passions that interest you, that allow you to find the in-between, the moment?
Yeah, like what am I focusing on now, if not extreme sports?
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to focus on creating art and spaces that allow people to explore themselves the way I've been able to through extreme sports, but without the consequence. Like you said, what do you do if you want to get that experience of base jumping, but you don't want to risk dying? That's really what I'm interested in. Doing events where people can do simulated base jumps and creating spaces where people can explore themselves, in a boundless type of way is what I'm really interested in.
I'll be interested to watch, Matt, how you continue to grow. I feel like you've done so much growing, but when you've had so many incredible life experiences, how do you proceed with there being less intensity as those previous experiences and still find the satisfaction? Or is that even needed? It's an interesting, do you know the answer to that?
I mean, well, I certainly don't need to be terrified like I was, back in the day anymore. I lived that experience. I did that. In many ways, I'm not even trying to go back to that type of intensity. I can tell you that I very much experience the same type of emotions when I see somebody do the things that I've done for the first time. And I can tell you that many of the things that I've been working on or worked on are intense in other ways. Like, when I was volunteering for a program in Los Angeles, working with survivors of domestic abuse and sexual assault, like that was super intense, very emotionally intense. More emotionally intense than anything that I've experienced base jumping. And I think I alluded to something of that kind back when you asked me, is this the most you've felt? So both I am not trying to go back and relive anything close to what I've already done. And also there are some things that I'm doing that are even more intense in certain aspects than what I've done.
This is going to be a weird question, Matt, but I'll ask it. Are you happy?
Sometimes.
Great answer.
But it's not, it's not a permanent state,
Yeah. Matt, tell me about a crossroads moment. Tell me about a moment that centers around a decision to do X, and that choice that may have been random or against what society says you should have done, but really brought about like tremendous significance to your life because of that choice, versus had you not made it.
I see you've slightly reframed that question from previous interviews, and I like it.
I'm growing.
Yeah. So like, I was going to bring this up about, the crossroads moment question that you've asked a bunch of people and how they arrived at their answer, and kind of like wanted to throw a little wrench in the works to say that oftentimes those crossroad moments that we think have changed our life direction actually didn't, and looking at like one in particular, Dan BC, I would say like his answer to that question is in my opinion, false. Like, even if like, I know he's the master of his own experience and like, he has every right to answer any way he wants. I'd still think that like he's actually wrong in the answer that he gave, which was that his life was completely changed by turning on to the drop zone in Arizona that one day and meeting those people that formed that team that eventually led to him being, this, huge success in competition skydiving, right? My analysis of why he's wrong is to say that like it didn't matter whether he turned onto that road at that time. He's a fucking gangster. Like the dude is a Michael Jordan character of our our sport. And no matter if he had turned onto that road or not, he would have eventually found people that were similar in their pursuits and similar in their motivations. And he would have found somebody to fund the team and somebody to sponsor their team. And he would have become that same person, regardless of like whether he turned in the, to that parking lot at that exact moment, and met those people at that exact time. Like if I were to look at his life trajectory, I gather a lot of this from the book that he wrote, Above All Else. I think the one crossroads moment that really changed his life was where he decided to sit on that Twin Otter the day that it crashed and killed the majority of his team and friends.
I think when I hear that, I hear destiny. He was destined to be the great person that he is. In my own experience, let's say, I don't know that it was my destiny to be a business person in the world of skydiving, I suppose. And maybe I'm wrong. But Dan knew that he wanted to be a world champion, and he sought after it. And it just so happened that driving into Eloy was a key piece of that narrative. For me, in the very fact that I'm talking to you, it was something as simple as leaving a business card on a van named Skydive Carolina Parachute Center, which then led to a friendship with my soon-to-be boss. And fast forward 20 plus years, and I'm talking to Matt Blank on the 20-Minute Call podcast, which is, rooted to skydiving. So if I don't do that, innocuous moment, tiny moment, I'm not talking to you. And I view that as a crossroads moment. Like, I did that thing and it was so unconscious, subconscious. And I'm wondering if you have a moment similar to that.
I mean, insofar as like we can't run from who we are, I believe that like there are so many moments like that I've said yes to who I am that have led to me being exactly where I am now. And so those are limitless. The decision to get into extreme sports, the decision to get into like the upper levels of extreme sports and become an instructor and, live life with no security and no, backdrop to travel around the world to meet all these crazy people and gather all of this, wild experience, I think is, all of those were decisions to say yes to who I was. I think that there are a few moments in my life that could have changed my trajectory altogether, and they all have to do with surviving. The moment that I was following Sebastian Alvarez over terrain and realizing that I was slipping back into his slipstream and not going to clear the knoll that we were heading for, and deciding to jog right and take an entirely new flight path, through a canyon terrain that I didn't realize I had not completely mapped, but ended up working out and, leading to me surviving that jump. That decision was like one that changed my entire life. Had I not made that decision, I definitely wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be absolutely unequivocally dead.
I mean, Matt, that is the absolute quintessential crossroads moment. That decision was everything. Fascinated by that. It's hard for me to encapsulate you, Matt. I knew we were going to have a 2-hour conversation today because your experiences are great and you have a lot to share. And where I feel like I wrote this down, pardon the shuffling of my papers, I think that you have figured, or you have a gift in that you are very aware of time. You have a gift in that you have a great awareness of time and how limited it is. And with that comes an appreciation for life and living and challenging oneself to a degree that I don't know. I've really enjoyed learning your perspective, and you're very balanced, it feels like. You're very matter of fact. You've thought through so much, and I feel that I could learn so much from you just by observing how you carry out your life. Thank you for sharing. I'm really, really grateful for this conversation. I learned a lot.
You're most welcome. I really appreciate the opportunity. I mean, all of what I've experienced is totally valueless unless I'm able to share it. And I'm really appreciative that you gave me the opportunity to do that. And, time is definitely limited, and I am absolutely blown away that you were willing to spend the time with me. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the pleasure was really mine. And I know that I will walk away from the conversation challenging myself. I think it takes, and I should add, it takes big balls to live a life of intention and to follow one's heart. It's like the adventurer's journey. You've been doing it. I don't want to make light of it, and it's been a journey, but boy, it takes great conviction and courage to go, I'm going to go this way, which is different than how all of society is telling you should be going. And I find that courageous. I don't know if you feel courageous, but I find it courageous.
Honestly, looking at the value of life, I find that it is, equally difficult and challenging to do either. Once you have the awareness of how short life is, it's incredibly challenging to do less than what you are naturally drawn to. It's also challenging to strike out, away from society's patterns and do something unique. I don't know. It's hard to say that I'm courageous for, striking out on this authentic path. Like, really, not doing that is the scariest shit ever to me. Like, if courage is doing something that scares you, then I'm certainly on the opposite end of whatever that conceptual spectrum is. I'm avoiding fear at all costs, and I am scared shitless of living a life that is less than my authentic path.
What a perfect spot to end. That will resonate with me. Thank you, Matt. Most grateful.
You're welcome.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to the 20-Minute Call podcast. Please do follow us on your podcast app so you always have the latest episode, which is released every Monday. If you want to contact the team, our email address is podcast@beyondmarketing.xyz. This episode was edited and engineered by Garnet Znydrick of the YouTube channel Blue Skies Fun Days. Thanks for listening, and join us next week for our next episode.